In light of recent events at Capitol Hill, we gathered 4 different LAHS students of varying political backgrounds to discuss their reaction to what happened on Wednesday, as well as how they think politics should be handled at Los Altos High.
I think I think the reason why it was significant, obviously, January 6th wasn't a random date. It was the date that the um, Congress was meant to confirm the results of the 2020 election.
It's not something that you can ever call insignificant. This is, as far as I can remember, one of the first attempts to actually violently stop the results of an election from going through. It's definitely something that needs to be remembered and won't be forgotten in a simple year. But at the same time, I don't think it's this ground shattering event that we need to etch into everyone's minds across the world, like some people are making it out to be. It just needs to be something that we never forget happened so that we can make sure it doesn't happen again. I just see it as a warning more than anything else.
For two reasons, I do think it was pretty important. One, just like the precedence of it, the fact that it, like the Capitol hasn't been infiltrated and never by American citizens before. I think since the War of 1812. I think the other is that I don't really think the effects of it will be truly understood or like felt for a while. I think it will potentially have a really big impact on kind of our political landscape and like how I think it will have an effect on people individually. We've seen how events in the past have like affected the growth of the alt right.
In terms of a purely political viewpoint of this is most likely devastating for the Republican Party. I'm just curious to see how it's going to play out because so far the Republican Party had all the support, but this one event most likely knocked out everyone in the middle or even leaning towards the right. And suddenly you would just have all of these people, like the Democrats had this entire thing of saying, we were against this, so we were the good guys in this event. And so that's just this massive amount of political support that they can put in. And I'm curious to see how that will play out in the future, as well as with the Biden administration coming in.
This has balanced the political scale. Because if you look at in terms of what this event has benefited the Democrats as opposed to the Republicans, and it's entirely benefited the Democrats, because they can blame the Republicans for doing this, even though it was a sector of individuals who happened to be Republican. And the reason it balanced the scale is because all the riots last year were benefiting the Republicans because it was liberally oriented people who were doing those riots primarily. If they continue with the rhetoric that this was a destruction of democracy or whatever the slogan is, then they'll garner more support by individuals who are apolitical, but they certainly won't garner support from people who consistently vote Republican because they know that this has nothing to do with policy.
I think I get what you're saying, and I definitely think that there is something to be said about kind of the immediate leverage of the situation. I think that it definitely put a dent in a lot of the claims that Republicans were able to, or not even Republicans, but just like the right in general was able to cling to with like law and order type slogans and stuff like that. But I also think that a lot of this is goes much deeper. So I think it's not that the Black Lives Matter protests or some of the riots that happened were purely negative, and I don't think they had a purely negative impact on the Democratic Party. And I think stuff like this, again, I do think it will have a negative impact on the Republican Party immediately, but I think that there's also a lot of stuff that happens underground and like in the grander scheme of things that this definitely does not destroy the ideologies that go behind that or the things that work behind the scenes that create these situations.
I disagree with the narrative that this and the Black Lives Matter protests are somehow comparable in terms of party damage. So the Democrat Party, for example, has been experiencing a bit of a split in terms of the difference between the establishment Democrats, who may be more inclined to work across the aisle, who may be more inclined to compromise on certain issues. And the more progressive wing that has started to come in since the 2018 midterms, the Black Lives Matter protest was, if not equally endorsed, at least supported by both the establishment and the progressives. Whereas in this case, I feel like a lot of establishment Republicans, even I believe Mike Pence himself, has really tried to distance themselves from the group of Republicans that seem to still cling on to Trump and still seem to try and justify this event. But because Trump is leaving, it's possible that a lot of his influence in government will go away. So people such as Ted Cruz, who were trying to oppose the confirmation of the 2020 election, and other Republicans who voted in opposition, may simply become more moderate again, slide back into that establishment after Trump leaves. This, in my opinion, is the effect of years and years of culmination of the Trump presidency. And it really shows that this country is polarized in a permanent way, not really a permanent way, but in a way that will supersede Trump's presidency.
There were several prominent Republicans who supported Trump that are now voicing against these actions. And I think that's also a big step into sort of moving away from this radical period that we had during the Trump presidency.
It's superficial. They're doing it to save their political careers.
I mean, yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, the idea that Mitch McConnell is trying to distance himself away from Trump in order to, because he's had a natural change in heart, in my opinion, is false. I think part of it is also because he's going to be losing power and he'll be out of government soon anyway. If they want to continue their careers, they're going to have to do so by distancing themselves away from Trump.
Their discussion transitioned into their opinion regarding the riots at Capitol Hill being compared to the Black Lives Matter protests, which began in late May.
How do you deduce whether something is mostly peaceful?
Statistics.
What are the statistics?
I believe it's at least over 90%. I think I've also seen at some point that 97% of Black Lives Matter protests were peaceful, but I can't confirm that. I know it's at least above 90%. I know I've seen that statistic for a fact. But there, I mean, obviously, I guess you could make the argument there can't be like incredibly precise statistics about something that's like continuously ongoing. But for the most part, this can be measured, and it has overwhelmingly been peaceful.
Well, I've seen online that people compare the two in relation to how the police reacted to them. And I've also heard that they can't be compared at all generally. I think they can be compared. Not in the way the police reacted to it. That doesn't make sense to me. Because you have magnitude, threat level, location, police offense versus defense, the time in which it took for it to break down from a protest to a riot, and certainly a myriad of other things, other factors in which would affect something.
I'm not sure I'm completely following like what you're trying to get at. Like you argue that in either of these situations, like police were on defense and that like they're, you know,
I didn't.
No, I know, but I guess I don't understand why they wouldn't be, or like how you're categorizing the two. I just don't know if I completely understand the point that you're making.
If you were to compare police reactions to two things, and the two things would have to be exactly the same for the police react to it exactly the same.
I mean, I guess obviously no situation is going to be exactly the same. However, I think when you see drastic differences in police responses, or things that just seem completely inappropriate in the context of the Capitol, versus when there was like direct like inciting of violence and like a determination to go in with riot gear and things, like there definitely was a very clear difference in response, and I do think you can make a comparison about those.
Black Lives Matter, the riots, the police reacted with rubber bullets, tear gas. Anyone can add comments how else they reacted. Can't recall. I saw shoving. Anyone else remember reactions to the riots by the police?
Yeah, I mean, there were rubber bull. I mean, obviously there were so many different protests and so many different reactions. There were definitely instances where people were peacefully protesting, taking a knee, things like that, completely peaceful, completely silent, and police would make people get up and leave. They were arresting people, they were setting curfews and then blocking exits to cities. On this one particular instance, it doesn't make sense as to why police would be sitting down letting these people in when, like, I guess I just don't fully understand how there isn't any precedence for.
Depends upon which clips you look at, because I've seen clips of Trump supporters being flashbanged. I've seen clips of them being tear gassed. I've seen clips of them being sprayed with pepper bullets, and I've been seeing clips of them being maced. Depends on which narrative you want to look at as to how they were treated.
Well, I mean, exactly. Obviously, there's different situations in all of this, but I think I'm not trying to say that every single police officer was sitting there doing nothing, because that's simply not true. However, it never for it to happen to this extent, and a lot of the other evidence that was also there did show that there definitely wasn't as much, like, I don't know, like, it definitely, there was a difference in response.
Different responses because they were entirely different. For example, with the riots, because in some areas like Portland, they were occurring for 90 consecutive days, you allowed the police time to get, say, the National Guard to come in and block the roads, and then set up these stations in which they can shoot these rubber bullets. You have the Capitol, in which it just got stormed. The police cannot react in the same manner within the same amount of time, or actually a different amount of time, to the same efficiency to stop something from occurring.
The students wrapped up their conversation by talking about the role of politics at Los Altos High School and ultimately how politics should be handled on a public school campus.
It seems inevitable that if you have a population that is predominantly on one political side, then the people who reside on the other side will feel marginalized or disenfranchised. However, the safe spaces don't help. And by that, I mean, when you create safe spaces, you shelter people from communication that might offend others, and that's necessary.
I would say that it's inevitable for the student body to be forming their own opinions, and a lot of that early on is probably going to be gathered from their parents, and they'll learn more and maybe lean more to one side, and that's natural, of course, as it is for any population. But the problem that I see is when um, teachers or the administration um, or just those types of those individuals themselves try to lean towards a specific narrative and kind of make their own views explicit.
We need to have set times and places for this sort of discussion, because in the current state, it's sort of just, it's prevalent throughout everything, but in very small amounts. You can't, like, it's there in every single period, whereas I feel like it would be a lot better, and you could also promote positive discussion about different ideas while moderating these to make sure it doesn't become destructive.
There's certain issues where it's like, I think it goes far beyond being cordial with my peers. And so while I definitely don't want to, do anything to create a hostile environment, I also think that there's a certain point where I don't necessarily feel that there are some ideas that I don't necessarily want to entertain or legitimize by having conversations with them. And I think that when we talk about a lot of this, a lot of times we kind of approach it as every opinion has equal merit. And while obviously everyone is entitled to their opinion, and having an opinion different than mine doesn't inherently mean that it's worth less. I think to some extent there are some conversations that have destructive consequences, and I think that, like, we need to keep that in mind.
Sure, you don't have to entertain the idea that some people have. So, obviously, if some person is, say, I don't know, racist, and you don't want to talk with them about racial theory, then you don't have to. My ultimate position is that individuals can choose who they want to interact with, but the school in general should not, as an institution, be taking their own political positions. The school administration should be trying their best to foster debate and discussion, and then it's up to the students whether they voluntarily want to participate in that. And I think that ultimately prepares students for the workplace. The students who I've met who try to walk away or run away from any type of political disagreement and would prefer to remain in their own echo chambers often appear to me as being largely amateurish and not really prepared for confronting the real world. In the workplace or the office, for example, you may have to work with people in your team, in your business, who are excellent workers. They have great skills, and when you work together you truly create something great, but you have to really leave politics out of it. That's why, whenever you hear about politics in the workplace, it's usually not followed by a happy story of fun discussions. It's usually followed by stories of lots of long periods of silence, lots of awkwardness, because ultimately people's political opinions are their own. And if you want to discuss something with them, you should either do it individually, set aside a separate time for it if the school is going to enforce it or moderate it, or just don't do it at all in such a public environment where it could cause some sort of, greater chaos.